Congresswoman Omar, if the United States and Somalia went to war tomorrow, hypothetically, which side would you want to win? The question didn't land like a question. It landed like a grenade with the pin pulled, rolling slowly across the mahogany table of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, coming to a rest right in front of the witness. It hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, like smoke lingering from a gun that had just been fired. Senator John Kennedy's voice had been soft, wrapped in that trademark Louisiana drawl that disarmed opponents and made the most lethal inquiries sound as casual as asking about the humidity in New Orleans. He sounded like a grandfather asking for a glass of sweet tea, but every single person in the crowded hearing room, the staffers lining the walls, the reporters hunching over their laptops, the three high-priced lawyers flanking the witness, knew exactly what this was. This was the kill shot. It was the culmination of 90 minutes of methodical, devastating questioning that had systematically stripped away every layer of defense Ilhan Omar had brought into the room. And now, there was silence. Complete, absolute silence. It was the kind of silence that has physical weight, pressing down on your chest, making you suddenly, uncomfortably aware of the sound of your own breathing and the hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. Ilhan Omar sat at the witness table, her posture rigid. 2 hours ago, she had walked into the Senate Heart Office building with the stride of someone who had survived worse than this. She had entered wearing a bright purple hijab and a matching suit, projecting an image of unshakable confidence. She was flanked by 3 attorneys in suits that cost more than most Americans made in a month. She had been defiant. She had been ready. After all, she had built an entire political brand on surviving Republican attacks. She had been called a terrorist, accused of anti-Semitism, and investigated for campaign finance violations. Every single time, she had emerged from the fire not just unscathed, but stronger, more celebrated by her progressive base, better at fundraising off the controversy, and more entrenched in her position as a martyr for her cause. But this was different. This wasn't a partisan attack about tax brackets or healthcare policy. This wasn't a debate about interpretation. This was a binary choice. A simple, terrifyingly binary choice. America or Somalia. And as the seconds ticked by, the horrifying realization began to dawn on everyone watching, both in the room and on the live feeds broadcast to millions of screens across the nation. She couldn't answer it. 10 seconds of silence passed. To a politician, 10 seconds is an eternity. It is enough time for a career to die. The silence stretched to 15 seconds. Then 20. The C-SPAN cameras zoomed in tight on her face, capturing the minute twitch of a muscle in her jaw, the way her eyes darted briefly to her legal counsel, desperate for a lifeline that wasn't there. Every cable news network, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, had broken away from their regular programming to cover this moment live. The chyrons at the bottom of the screen were already flashing. Kennedy grills, Omar on loyalty. "That's a ridiculous hypothetical," Omar finally said. Her voice had lost the smooth, practiced cadence of her opening statement. It had that sharp, defensive edge that emerged whenever she felt cornered. It was a dismissal, an attempt to swat the question away like a fly. Kennedy didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply leaned back in his leather chair, looking for all the world like he had all the time in history. "It's a simple question, ma'am. Every American should be able to answer it in 1 second. Which side would you want to win?" Another pause. This one was even more painful than the first. You could almost see the calculations firing behind her eyes, the wheels turning frantically as she searched for an exit ramp. But the trap Kennedy had laid was perfect in its simplicity. There was no good answer. If she said America, she would be on record contradicting everything she had said for years to her Somali-American base in Minnesota. She would be betraying the narrative she had carefully cultivated, that she was a voice for the diaspora, a defender of her homeland. If she said Somalia, her career in the United States Congress would end before the sun went down. It would be an admission of treason on national television. And if she said neither? If she tried to dodge or weave or lecture the senator on the nuance of geopolitics? Everyone knew what that meant anyway. In a loyalty test, hesitation is a confession. I refuse to engage with Islamophobic hypotheticals designed to question my loyalty, she snapped, playing the card that had saved her so many times before. She tried to look indignant, tried to summon the righteous anger that usually rallied her supporters. But Kennedy held up a hand. His expression didn't change. His voice remained gentle, almost kind, which somehow made the dismantling feel even more brutal. I haven't mentioned your religion once, ma'am. Not once in 2 hours. I've asked about your allegiance to countries, not your faith. I've asked which country you'd choose if forced to choose, America or Somalia. That's not about Islam. That's about loyalty. He reached out and picked up a single document from the neat stack in front of him. He handled the paper with care, as if it were a piece of evidence in a murder trial. Because we have recordings of you telling Somali-American audiences that our homeland is being attacked by America. You've said our people back home need our help. You've referred to Somalia as home in the present tense 43 times in the past 5 years. So I'm asking, when you say home, which country do you mean? I can have a complex identity, Omar shot back, her voice rising. You can have any identity you want, ma'am, Kennedy interrupted, cutting through her defense with surgical precision. You can be proud of your heritage. You can love Somali culture. But you can only have one allegiance in the United States Congress. You swore an oath to the Constitution of the United States, not the Somali Constitution, not both. One. He took off his reading glasses and looked her dead in the eye. So, one last time. If America and Somalia went to war, which side would you want to win? 25 seconds of silence now. 30. It was arguably the longest, loudest silence in modern congressional hearing history. The air in the room was electric, vibrating with the tension of a political execution happening in real time. Staffers stopped typing. The Capitol police officers by the doors shifted their weight. And then, just as the tension reached a breaking point, something happened that nobody expected. Someone in the audience stood up. To understand how a sitting member of the United States Congress found herself staring into the abyss of political oblivion, frozen by a simple question about loyalty, you have to rewind the clock. You have to go back 90 minutes before the silence, before the cameras zoomed in, before the kill shot. In fact, you have to go back 3 weeks earlier to a chilly Tuesday morning that changed everything. It started with a headline. 3 weeks prior to the hearing, ProPublica, the investigative journalism outlet known for toppling giants, published a story that hit Washington, D.C. like a meteor strike. The headline was stark, devoid of sensationalism, and terrifying in its implications. Congresswoman's secret coordination. How Ilhan Omar's office worked with Somali government to influence U.S. policy. The investigation was devastating not because of its rhetoric, but because of its receipts. It wasn't an opinion piece. It was a forensic accounting of betrayal. The reporters had obtained phone records showing dozens of calls between Omar's private office and high-ranking Somali government officials. They had uncovered emails explicitly coordinating messaging on foreign aid bills. They found meeting logs that hadn't been properly disclosed under House ethics rules. Most damning of all, they had traced the money. Financial records showed hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing from organizations with direct ties to the Somali government into Omar's campaign coffers, and, even more suspiciously, into her husband's consulting business. The pattern revealed by the investigation was undeniable and methodical. It operated like clockwork. Ilhan Omar would receive a classified intelligence briefing about the Horn of Africa in her capacity as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Within 48 hours of that briefing, phone logs showed she would have a lengthy call or a private meeting with Somali government officials. Then, almost immediately after, she would cast a vote or make a public statement that aligned perfectly with the interests of the Somali government, even when those interests directly conflicted with the stated national security policy of the United States. Washington is a town that thrives on scandal. But this was different. This wasn't a sex scandal or a minor corruption beef. This smelled like espionage. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, usually a slow-moving, deliberative body, moved with unprecedented speed. They voted to hold emergency oversight hearings. They issued a subpoena for Ilhan Omar to testify under oath. At 9:45 a.m. on the day of the hearing, the corridors of the Senate Hart Office building were a zoo. Reporters were shouting questions, camera crews were jostling for position, and protesters from both sides were chanting outside. But inside the hearing room, the atmosphere was serious. Ilhan Omar arrived 15 minutes early. She was 43 years old, a woman who had lived a life that was nothing short of a movie script. She had come to America as a 12-year-old refugee, fleeing the brutal civil war in Somalia. She had spent 4 years in a dusty refugee camp in Kenya, learned English from scratch, worked her way up as a community organizer, and shocked the political establishment by winning a House seat in 2016. She was a member of the Squad, the group of progressive Congresswomen who had become celebrities to the left and villains to the right. As she took her seat at the witness table, arranging her papers and whispering to her legal team, she looked confident. Her communications team was already in the audience, thumbs flying over their phone screens, ready to tweet the hearing and spin whatever happened as a racist, partisan witch hunt. She believed she knew how this would play out. The Republicans would attack her, she would call them bigots, the Democrats would rally around her, and she would raise $1 million off the clips. It was the standard playbook. What Ilhan Omar didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that Senator John Kennedy wasn't playing by the standard playbook. While Omar had been preparing for a media circus, John Kennedy had spent the last 6 weeks in the bowels of the Russell Senate office building doing something else entirely. He was building a legal case. Kennedy was 73 years old, with a folksy demeanor and a thick corn syrup Louisiana accent that led many people to underestimate him. He played the character of the confused country lawyer to perfection. But his resume told a different story. He had been an undergraduate at Vanderbilt, a law student at the University of Virginia, and had studied at Oxford. He had been a practicing attorney for 2 decades. He possessed a mind like a steel trap, and he knew that you didn't catch a politician with grand speeches. You caught them with details. 6 weeks earlier, Kennedy had given his chief of staff a simple instruction. Get me everything. He didn't just want the ProPublica findings. He wanted every word Ilhan Omar had ever spoken in public about Somalia. He wanted transcripts of her speeches in Somali, translated by certified interpreters. He wanted her voting record cross-referenced with her travel schedule. He wanted to know who she was when she thought no one outside her community was listening. His staff had delivered. They brought him 3 boxes of documents. Kennedy had sat in his office late into the night, reading through transcripts, highlighting passages, connecting dots. He found what he was looking for within the first few hours. "It's a pattern," he had told his chief of staff, tapping a transcript from a 2019 speech. "Look at the language. She consistently identifies as Somali first, American second, or not at all. She refers to Somalia as home in the present tense. She calls Somalis our people. When she talks about Somali Americans, she says we and us. When she talks about Americans generally, she says they and them." He had spent 2 weeks analyzing her voting record. The correlation was 100%. On 12 separate votes related to Somalia, sanctions, aid, military operations, she had sided with the Somali government every single time. And the financial trail? It was the glue that held the narrative together. Kennedy didn't need to prove she was a spy. He didn't need to prove she had handed over a briefcase full of secrets. All he needed to do was ask the questions that would force her to reveal where her heart truly lay. As the gavel banged to bring the hearing to order at 10:04 a.m., Kennedy sat quietly at his dais, organizing his papers into neat, terrifying stacks. He looked down at his notes, adjusted his glasses, and waited. He wasn't going to scream. He wasn't going to grandstand. He was simply going to close the trap, one gentle question at a time. The unsuspecting Congresswoman adjusted her microphone, completely unaware that she was sitting in the crosshairs of the most meticulously planned political ambush in decades. The sound of the gavel striking the wooden block was not a sharp crack, but a dull, heavy thud that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing room. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing on compliance with the Foreign Agents Registration Act and congressional ethics will now come to order. Chairman Bob Menendez's voice was dry, bureaucratic, and utterly devoid of the drama that was crackling in the air like static electricity. It was 10:00 a.m. sharp. The room was packed to capacity. A claustrophobic sea of navy blue suits, press badges, and the flashing red lights of recording equipment. The air smelled of stale coffee, furniture polish, and the peculiar, acrid scent of high-stakes political anxiety. For the first 45 minutes, the proceedings followed the predictable, tired choreography of Washington, D.C. political theater. It was a play everyone had seen 1,000 times, performed by actors who knew their lines by heart. The ranking Democrat opened with a passionate, table-thumping defense of Ilhan Omar. He characterized the hearing not as a legitimate inquiry into potential FARA violations or financial improprieties, but as a shameful partisan witch hunt, driven by xenophobia and a refusal to accept a refugee woman of color in a position of power. He spoke of her resilience, her historic election, and the dangerous precedent of questioning the loyalty of a sitting member of Congress. Omar sat through this defense with a practiced stoicism, nodding solemnly at the appropriate moments. Under the table, her leg did not bounce. Her hands were folded neatly on the green felt. She looked comfortable. She had survived this arena before. She knew that as long as the accusations remained in the realm of racism and bigotry, she was on safe ground. Those were battles she could win. Those were battles that rallied her base and opened wallets from Minneapolis to Manhattan. Then came the Republicans. They countered with high-minded speeches about national security, the sanctity of the legislative process, and the concerning reports regarding classified information. They used words like integrity, transparency, and foreign influence. It was bluster, largely performative, designed for 30-second sound bites on evening opinion shows. Through it all, Senator John Kennedy sat silently at the far end of the dais. He did not speak. He did not nod. He did not look at the cameras. He was busy arranging his workspace with the meticulous obsession of a watchmaker. He placed a glass of water just so. He aligned his pens in a perfect row. And then he opened the binder. It was a thick, black, 3-ring binder, devoid of markings. To the casual observer, it looked like standard committee briefing materials. But inside, tabbed and color-coded, were the 3 pillars of the case he had spent 6 weeks constructing. First, the rhetoric, a chronological log of every public statement Omar had made in Somali, transcribed and translated, revealing a linguistic pattern that no one in the English-speaking press had caught. Second, the legislative action, a spreadsheet correlating her voting record with the strategic interests of the Somali government. A perfect, unbroken line of 100% alignment. Third, the timing. The smoking gun timeline that overlaid her access to classified intelligence with her communications with foreign officials. Kennedy wasn't listening to the speeches. He was reviewing the trap. He knew that the moment the chairman recognized him, the theater would end, and the trial would begin. He watched Omar from over the rim of his reading glasses. She looked bored, perhaps slightly annoyed, checking her watch as a junior senator from Florida droned on about the importance of the rule of law. She thought she was safe. She thought this was just another day of partisan bickering where no minds changed and no blows landed. "Senator Kennedy," the chairman said, looking down the line, "you are recognized for 10 minutes. The shift in the room was subtle, but immediate. The whispering among the staffers died down. The reporters, who had been half listening while checking Twitter, looked up. Kennedy was known for his colorful sound bites, his aw shucks metaphors that went viral. Everyone expected a show. Kennedy took a slow sip of water. He let the silence stretch for 5, 6, 7 seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft that the technicians in the back of the room had to scramble to boost the gain on his microphone. "Congresswoman Omar," he began, his Louisiana drawl thick and syrupy, wrapping around the syllables like molasses. "Thank you for being here today." Omar nodded, leaning into her microphone. "Thank you, Senator." "I know you didn't want to come," Kennedy continued, offering a small, sympathetic smile. "Nobody likes being subpoenaed. It's about as much fun as a root canal without the Novocaine. But I appreciate your cooperation with this committee's oversight responsibilities." Omar offered a tight, polite smile in return. She was waiting for the attack, the raised voice, the accusation. "I want to start by acknowledging your remarkable personal story," Kennedy said, leaning back in his chair, looking less like an inquisitor and more like a neighbor chatting over a fence. Coming to America as a young refugee, spending 4 years in a camp, learning a new language, a new culture, becoming a citizen, getting elected to Congress. That's extraordinary, truly. That is the American dream, in flesh and blood. Omar's expression softened. Her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. This wasn't the line of questioning she had prepared for. "Thank you, Senator," she said, her voice sounding genuine for the first time that morning. "I am very proud of my journey." "And you should be," Kennedy said warmly. "And I mean that sincerely. I believe in immigration. When people come here legally, work hard, embrace American values, become Americans, that's what makes this country special. That's what has always made us special. It's the gumbo that gives us our flavor." For a moment, the hearing room felt almost cozy. The tension that had been building during the opening statements began to dissipate. Kennedy was disarming her, charmed her, and, by extension, charming the audience. Even the Democratic staffers looked confused, wondering if Kennedy was going off script. But John Kennedy wasn't off script. He was laying the foundation. He knew that to prove a betrayal, he first had to establish the bond that was broken. He had to make her acknowledge the contract before he could show the breach. He adjusted his glasses, his face turning serious, but not severe. "Which is why I want to understand something that has been troubling me, Congresswoman. Something that goes to the heart of that journey you just described." The trap was set. The door was open, and Ilhan Omar, disarmed by the praise and the gentle tone, walked right through it. "When you became a U.S. citizen, you took an oath," Kennedy said. The statement wasn't a question, but he paused as if inviting her to agree. "Do you remember that oath?" "Yes, Senator," Omar replied. She was still relaxed, leaning back in her chair, perhaps thinking he was going to ask for a soundbite about patriotism that she could easily provide. "Can you recite any of it for the committee?" There was a micro pause, a beat of hesitation. It was the first crack in the veneer. "I swore allegiance to the United States and to uphold the Constitution," she said, her tone flattening slightly, sensing a shift in the wind. "You did more than that, ma'am," Kennedy said. He didn't look at her. He looked down at the binder, flipping a page with a deliberate, audible crinkle. "The oath of citizenship is very specific. It's not just a promise to support the new. It's a requirement to reject the old. You swore that you, and I quote, absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty." Kennedy looked up. The folksy warmth was gone, replaced by the cold, hard stare of a prosecutor who has just entered Exhibit A into the record. "That means you specifically renounced allegiance to Somalia. Do you remember that part?" "Yes," she said. The word was clipped. "Good," Kennedy said, "because I want to talk about those oaths today. I want to understand if you've honored them. And I think the American people deserve to understand that too." The atmosphere in room 419 transformed instantly. The coziness of the previous minute evaporated, replaced by a razor-wire tension. Kennedy wasn't asking about policy or appropriations. He was questioning the fundamental legitimacy of her standing as an American official. "Let me start with some basic factual questions," Kennedy continued, pulling a document from the binder. "I want to talk about how you describe your relationship with Somalia." He adjusted his reading glasses, peering at the text before him. "Congresswoman, in 2019, you gave a speech at a Somali-American community event in Minneapolis. You were discussing U.S. drone strikes in the Horn of Africa. According to the transcript, translated from Somali, you said, and I'm reading your exact words, 'Our homeland is under attack. Our people are being killed by American drones.'" Kennedy stopped reading and looked over the rims of his glasses. "Do you remember saying that?" Omar's voice took on a cautious, measured tone. Her lawyers were scribbling furiously on legal pads next to her. "I was expressing concern about civilian casualties in Somalia, Senator. It is a humanitarian issue." "I understand the concern," Kennedy interrupted. his voice still calm but carrying a new, insistent weight. Civilian casualties are tragic, but I'm asking about your specific language. You said our homeland. You didn't say the Somali homeland or their homeland. You said our homeland, meaning your homeland. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the dais. Is Somalia your homeland? I was born there. Omar deflected, her eyes darting to the side. But you're an American citizen now, ma'am, Kennedy countered immediately. You've lived in the United States for over 20 years. You are a member of the United States Congress. You represent 700,000 Americans. When you say our homeland about Somalia, who is the our? Who are you including yourself with? Omar shifted in her seat. The chair suddenly seemed uncomfortable. Senator, I can have pride in my heritage without— Of course you can, Kennedy cut in. Nobody is questioning your right to be proud of where you came from. Heritage is what you are born with. Allegiance is what you choose. There is a difference. He tapped the paper with his index finger. So, let me ask again. When you said our homeland, were you referring to Somalia as your homeland? Politically? Nationally? I consider myself Somali American, she said. That's a dodge, ma'am, Kennedy said softly. You can be ethnically Somali and culturally American, but you can only have one homeland in terms of political allegiance, the country you owe loyalty to. So which is it? Is Somalia your homeland, or is America your homeland? The room held its breath. It was a question that stripped away the nuance of identity politics and demanded a binary answer. America is my country, she said finally, but the hesitation was palpable. Kennedy didn't celebrate the concession. He simply moved the chess piece forward. You call it my country now, but the record suggests otherwise. He flipped another page. Let me show you another example. In 2021, at a fundraiser for Somali famine relief. Noble cause, absolutely. But listen to what you said. He tapped a button on a tablet in front of him. Audio played through the hearing room's speakers. It was slightly grainy, recorded on a cell phone, but Ilhan Omar's voice was unmistakable, speaking in English this time, passionate and urgent. Our people back home are suffering. The drought has devastated our communities. We must do everything we can to help our brothers and sisters back home. They are our family. We cannot abandon them. Kennedy let the silence linger for a moment after the clip ended. You said, our people back home, not the people of Somalia, not Somalis who are suffering. You said, our people back home. He looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and accusation. Back home, like Somalia is still home and you're just temporarily away. Is that how you see it, Congresswoman? Are you an expat living in America, or are you an American? That is twisting my words, Omar snapped, her composure cracking. I was speaking to a community in pain. I'm playing your exact words, ma'am, Kennedy replied, his voice unyielding. Audio recording. No twisting involved. You said back home about Somalia in the present tense. My staff has documented 43 instances over the past 5 years where you have referred to Somalia as home, homeland, or back home. 43 times. He paused, letting the number sink in. And in those same 5 years, do you know how many times you have referred to America as home or my homeland? He waited. She didn't answer. She stared at him, her jaw set tight. The answer is 0, ma'am, Kennedy said, his voice dropping to a whisper that echoed louder than a scream. Not once. You call it this country or the United States, always at a distance, like you're describing a hotel you're staying in, not the place you belong. Why is that? The silence that followed Kennedy's query about Omar's refusal to call America home was not an empty void. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that settled over the hearing room. Omar stared at him, her jaw tight, her eyes dark and unreadable. She offered no defense, perhaps realizing that any explanation distinguishing residence from homeland would only dig the hole deeper. Kennedy didn't wait for an answer that wasn't coming. He simply closed the binder on the section marked Rhetoric and reached for a large foam core board leaning against the legs of his desk. "Words are important, Congresswoman," Kennedy said, his voice shifting from the philosophical tone of the previous questioning to something sharper, more clinical. "But actions? Actions are where the rubber meets the road. You can say whatever you want to a crowd in Minneapolis, but how you vote in this chamber affects national security. It affects lives." He lifted the board onto an easel so the cameras and the audience could see it clearly. It was a simple bar chart, stark in its binary contrast. Red and blue. "Let's talk about your voting record," Kennedy said, picking up a laser pointer. A red dot danced across the chart. "In the past 5 years, there have been exactly 12 bills, amendments, or resolutions in the House of Representatives that directly related to Somalia. These weren't broad foreign aid packages where Somalia was just a line item. These were specific measures: sanctions on corrupt government officials, conditions on security assistance, oversight mandates, and resolutions condemning human rights abuses." He looked over at her. 12 separate votes. Do you know how you voted on those 12 measures? Omar didn't answer. She took a sip of water, her hand trembling ever so slightly. "I'll tell you," Kennedy said, answering his own question. "You voted in favor of the Somali government's interests and against stated U.S. policy positions all 12 times. 12 out of 12. That is a 100% success rate for the government in Mogadishu." A murmur rippled through the press gallery. Reporters were typing furiously now. Kennedy flipped a page in his notes. "Let me give you a specific example, just so we aren't dealing in abstractions." He pointed to a date on the timeline. In 2021, the House considered the Somalia Stabilization and Accountability Act. This bill was designed to impose targeted sanctions, asset freezes and travel bans on 15 specific Somali government officials and military officers. These weren't random bureaucrats. These were men with documented, verified ties to al-Shabaab, a terrorist organization that has killed American soldiers, aid workers, and journalists. Kennedy leaned forward, his brow furrowed as if he were genuinely confused. The bill was very specific. It named 15 individuals. It passed the House with overwhelming bipartisan support, 391 to 4. You were one of the 4 who voted no. Why? The bill was overly broad, Omar said quickly, reciting a talking point that sounded rehearsed. Sanctions regimes often hurt the innocent population rather than the targets. I have always opposed broad sanctions that punish the poor. "Ma'am, I just told you it wasn't broad," Kennedy countered, his voice dropping an octave, becoming gravelly. "It wasn't an embargo. It didn't stop food or medicine. It froze the bank accounts of 15 men who financed terrorism. How does freezing a warlord's Wells Fargo account hurt a poor child in Mogadishu?" "It sets a precedent of American imperialism," she began. "It sets a precedent of fighting terrorism," Kennedy snapped, cutting her off for the first time. The flash of anger was brief but startling. He regained his composure instantly. You voted to protect the financial assets of men who want to kill Americans. That is the reality of your vote. Is there another explanation? Because the only one that makes sense to me is that you were protecting the Somali government's allies over America's security interests. I voted my conscience, Omar said, her voice tight. I voted based on my understanding of the region's complexities. Your conscience seems to align perfectly with the Somali Foreign Ministry's press releases, Kennedy noted dryly. Let's look at another one. 2022. An amendment to add accountability measures to $400 million in U.S. foreign aid to Somalia. He traced the timeline with the laser pointer. This amendment didn't cut a single dime of aid. Not one penny. All it required was for the Somali government to provide quarterly reports proving that the money wasn't being stolen or diverted to warlords. It was basic forensic accounting. Every other country receiving aid has to do it. Kennedy looked at her, his eyes wide with mock incredulity. The amendment passed 357 to 18. You voted no. You voted against transparency. You voted against ensuring American taxpayer dollars weren't being stolen. Why? The conditions were punitive, Omar insisted. They were designed to undermine the sovereignty of the Somali government. They were designed to stop theft, Congresswoman, Kennedy said. You talk about sovereignty like you're their defense attorney. You are a U.S. representative. Your job is to protect American sovereignty and American tax dollars. Why are you more concerned with the dignity of corrupt Somali officials than the wallet of the American taxpayer? Omar stared straight ahead, refusing to engage further. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was an admission. 12 times, Kennedy repeated, shaking his head slowly. Sanctions on terrorists? No. Oversight on funding? No. Condemning human rights abuses by Somali police? You voted present. You couldn't even bring yourself to condemn torture because it was being done by your people back home. He took a breath, letting the weight of the voting record sink into the room. If you look at this chart, Congresswoman, and you cover up the name at the top, if you just look at the votes, you wouldn't think this was the voting record of an American Congresswoman. You'd think it was the voting record of a Somali lobbyist. And speaking of lobbyists, Kennedy said, pivoting seamlessly as he pulled a new stack of documents from his binder. Let's talk about the engine that drives all of this. Let's talk about the money. If the previous section had been about ideology and loyalty, this section was about corruption. The air in the room shifted from tense to dangerous. In Washington, being accused of disloyalty is damaging, but being accused of financial impropriety is fatal. Kennedy held up a thick sheaf of papers stapled together. These are Federal Election Commission reports, public records. You filed them yourself? He opened the report to a bookmarked page. In the 2022 election cycle, your campaign received a bundle of contributions totaling $847,000 from an organization called the Somali American Leadership Council. He looked over his glasses. That is a staggering amount of money from a single source, Congresswoman. Nearly $1 million. What is the Somali American Leadership Council? Omar's lead lawyer leaned over and whispered frantically in her ear. Omar nodded, then spoke carefully. It is a community organization that supports Somali American candidates and civic engagement. It is a domestic non-profit. It is a lobbying front, ma'am, Kennedy corrected, his voice flat and factual. I have their tax filings right here. They are funded primarily, over 80%, by Somali business conglomerates based in Mogadishu. conglomerates that have direct, documented contracts with the Somali government. He held up a tax document. You received nearly $850,000 from an organization that is effectively a pass-through entity for foreign business interests. Did you tell your constituents in Minneapolis that their Congresswoman was being bankrolled by foreign oligarchs? The contributions were legal, Omar said, her voice rising in defensive anger. They were properly disclosed. We followed every FEC guideline. I didn't ask if they were legal, Kennedy shot back. I asked if they were honest. I asked if you disclosed to the voters that you were taking cash from the same people you were protecting with your votes. He didn't wait for an answer. He moved to the next document. And it's not just your campaign. It's your household, your husband's consulting firm, the E Street Group. Omar flinched. Bringing family into a hearing was a breach of etiquette, but Kennedy was far past etiquette. According to public records, in 2023, the E Street Group received $280,000 in consulting fees from Somali business interests. That is triple what the company made from any other client that year. Kennedy paused, letting the numbers hang in the air. What services did your husband's firm provide to a Somali construction conglomerate to justify a $250,000 paycheck? My husband's business is separate from my congressional work, Omar said, her face flushing with genuine anger. This is out of bounds. You live in the same house, Kennedy exclaimed, his voice booming for the first time. You share finances. You file joint tax returns. And his income tripled the exact same year you started voting against sanctions on the people paying him. You don't see a connection there? That is innuendo, she spat. It is a smear. It is a timeline, Kennedy said coldly. He reached for a second foam core board. This one was a timeline, a long horizontal axis marked with dates. I want everyone to look at this, Kennedy said, tracing the line with his laser pointer. This is where the money meets the votes. It's a pattern, Congresswoman, and patterns don't lie. He pointed to a hash mark on the timeline. August 2021. You have a private dinner with the Somali ambassador in D.C. 2 weeks later, the Somali American Leadership Council donates $50,000 to your legal defense fund. 3 days after that, you vote no on the sanctions bill. He moved the pointer to the next mark. March 2022. Your husband's firm receives a wire transfer for $75,000 from a Mogadishu-based telecommunications company. 1 week later, you meet with the Somali foreign minister. 10 days after that, you vote against the Oversight Amendment for foreign aid. Kennedy looked at her, his face a mask of disappointment. 17 times, Congresswoman. 17 times in 5 years. We have this exact sequence. Money moves, a meeting happens, and then you vote to protect Somali interests. That is not a coincidence. That is a transaction. The room was deadly silent. The accusations of espionage and disloyalty were abstract. This was concrete. This was quid pro quo. You are being paid, Kennedy said, his voice dropping to a whisper again. You are being paid hundreds of thousands of dollars by Somali government-connected sources while voting to protect them. You aren't acting as a U.S. representative. You are acting as a paid foreign agent who happens to have a voting card in the U.S. House. Omar stared at him, hatred burning in her eyes, but she said nothing. Her lawyers were frozen. There was no objection to make. The dates were on the board. The money was in the filings. The votes were in the congressional record. That's not public service, ma'am, Kennedy said, closing the binder on the financial section with a heavy thud. That is a conflict of interest so deep I can't see the bottom of it. If the revelation of financial impropriety had sucked the oxygen out of the room, John Kennedy's next pivot brought the temperature down to absolute zero. He didn't close the binder this time. Instead, he reached for a separate folder, this one stamped with red markings that usually indicated sensitive material, though what he pulled out were unclassified, redacted logs. "Money is one thing, Congresswoman," Kennedy said, his voice stripping away the last remnants of the genial country lawyer. "Greed is a sin, but it is a common one in this town. But what I want to talk about now is something far more dangerous. I want to talk about access." He held up the red-stamped folder. "You serve on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. It is a prestigious assignment. It gives you access to the Situation Room. It gives you access to the highest levels of American intelligence. Is that correct?" "Yes," Omar replied warily. "Specifically," Kennedy continued, "it gives you access to classified intelligence briefings about the Horn of Africa. You receive updates on terrorist threats, U.S. military movements, drone operations, and intelligence assessments regarding the Somali government. Correct?" "I cannot discuss classified information in this setting," Omar recited automatically. "I'm not asking you to reveal the information," Kennedy said. "I am asking about the timing of your access to it." He pulled out a new document, a timeline that looked dangerously similar to the financial one, but the stakes were infinitely higher. "These are call logs obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests regarding your official office line, cross-referenced with the committee's briefing schedule." Kennedy put on his glasses. "August 12, 2023. You attended a closed-door, classified briefing on al-Shabaab activity in southern Somalia and U.S. counterterrorism strategy. That briefing ended at 4 p.m. He looked up. That same evening, at 7:43 p.m., you placed a 40-minute phone call to the personal cell phone of the Somali ambassador. What did you discuss in that call, Congresswoman?" Omar blinked. I don't recall the specific conversation. I engage in routine diplomatic conversations as part of my committee work." "Routine diplomatic conversations?" Kennedy repeated, skepticism dripping from every syllable. "Let's look at another one. September 3, 2023. Another classified briefing. This one regarding U.S. naval operations near the Gulf of Aden. Extremely sensitive stuff. That same night, you had a 35-minute call with a senior official at the Somali Foreign Ministry." Kennedy slammed his hand on the desk, a sudden violent noise that made everyone jump. "Ma'am, this is a pattern. 17 times in 3 years. You attend a classified briefing about Somalia, and within 48 hours, you are on the phone with the Somali government. At minimum, that shows a catastrophic lack of judgment. At worst," he let the word hang there, unfinished, but everyone heard it, "espionage." "I have never compromised classified information," Omar shouted, her voice shaking with genuine fear for the first time. "That is a lie." "Then explain the calls," Kennedy demanded. "Explain why the Somali government needs to hear from you immediately after you hear from the CIA. If you aren't sharing classified maps and names, you are at least sharing insights. You are giving them the playbook. You are telling them which way the wind is blowing in Washington so they can maneuver against us. Either way, you are serving their interests, not ours." He stared at her, breathing hard. "You are acting as a conduit. You are the pipeline through which American intelligence flows to Mogadishu." Omar was stunned into silence. Her lawyers were frantically whispering, but there was no legal objection to a timeline. It was circumstantial, Yes, but damning. Kennedy took a deep breath, composing himself. He looked over at the chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have established the rhetoric. I have established the voting record. I have established the financial conflict of interest. And I have established the security risk. He turned back to face the audience, scanning the rows of faces until he found who he was looking for. But the Congresswoman's defense has always been that she represents a community, that she is the voice of the diaspora. So, with the chairman's permission, I would like to yield the remainder of my time to a witness who can speak to that. The chairman, caught off guard, nodded. Proceed. I call Amina Hassan, Kennedy said. From the 8th row on the left side, a woman stood up. She was in her mid-40s, wearing a black hijab and a sharply tailored gray suit. She walked to the witness microphone that had been set up for public testimony. The room was confused. This wasn't on the schedule. Ilhan Omar turned in her chair, her eyes widening as she recognized the woman. Amina Hassan was not a political operative. She was a legend in the Minneapolis Somali community, a nurse, a mother of 4, and a refugee whose story was as harrowing as Omar's own. Thank you, Senator, Amina said. Her voice was steady, clear, and carried a gravity that silenced the murmurs in the room. She turned to face the witness table. And thank you, Congresswoman Omar. Omar looked wary. Ms. Hassan. Congresswoman, Amina began, I voted for you in 2016. I knocked on doors for you in 2018. I was proud. I cried when you won. To see a Somali woman, a refugee, sitting in the halls of power. It felt like we had arrived. She paused, her hands gripping the podium. But I am here today because you do not represent me. You do not represent our community. You represent a foreign government that we fled. The accusation hit harder than any of Kennedy's charts. This was an insider threat. My family fled Somalia in 1993, Amina continued, her voice gaining strength. My father was killed by militias in Mogadishu, militias supported by the same warlords you voted to protect from sanctions. We spent 3 years in a camp in Kenya. We starved. We prayed. And when we finally came to America, my mother fell to her knees at the airport. She said, "We are safe. We are finally home." Amina looked directly at Omar, her eyes burning. We became citizens in 2001. I remember the ceremony. I was 16. When we took the oath renouncing allegiance to Somalia, my mother squeezed my hand and whispered, "We are Americans now." And she meant it. We all meant it. Somalia failed us, Ilhan, Amina said, using her first name, breaking the protocol to strike at the human level. The government there is corrupt. It is violent. It is broken. We chose America. We love this country. When people ask me where I am from, I say Minnesota. When they ask where home is, I say America. Without hesitation. Without qualification. She pointed a finger at the Congresswoman. But you keep calling Somalia home. You keep taking money from the Somali government. You keep voting to help the regime that drove us out. You are not representing Somali Americans who love this country. You are representing the ghost of the country that tried to kill us. And we are tired of you claiming to speak for us while you serve them. Omar stared at her, her mouth slightly open. This was the one attack she had no shield for. She couldn't call Amina a racist. She couldn't call her an Islamophobe. She was looking in a mirror, and the reflection was screaming at her. "Thank you, Ms. Hassan," Kennedy said softly. He waited for Amina to sit down before turning back to Omar. The room felt small, intimate, and devastating. "Congresswoman," Kennedy said, "you just heard from your own constituent, a refugee like you. a Muslim like you. And she says you don't represent her. She says you represent a foreign power. He gathered his papers into a single, neat stack. The climax had arrived. Senator Kennedy sat motionless for a moment, letting the echo of Amina Hassan's testimony fade into the heavy air of the hearing room. He looked at Ilhan Omar, not with anger, but with a strange, almost pitying intensity. The devastating assembly of evidence, the rhetorical patterns, the voting record, the financial trails, the clandestine calls, and now the rejection by her own community, lay on the table between them like a physical barrier. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together. The slowness of his movement was deliberate. It built tension. It forced every camera lens and every pair of eyes to focus on him. "Congresswoman," Kennedy began, his voice low and devoid of theatrics, "we have established a great deal today. We have established that you refer to Somalia as home, in the present tense, 43 times. We have established that you have voted in favor of Somali government interests 100% of the time, even when it contradicted U.S. policy. We have established that you take hundreds of thousands of dollars from foreign connected sources. We have established that you communicate with foreign officials immediately after receiving American intelligence." He paused, looking up at the ceiling as if gathering his final thought. "And we have established that your own constituents feel betrayed." He looked back at her. "So, I want to ask you one final question. It is not a trick question. It is not a gotcha question. It is a clarifying question. And I want you to answer it honestly, because I believe the American people, and the Somali American people, deserve to know where you stand." The room went completely still. Even the air handlers seemed to quiet down. Kennedy took a breath. "Congresswoman Omar, if the United States and Somalia went to war tomorrow, hypothetically, an armed conflict between the two nations, which side would you want to win?" The question hung there. It was brutal in its simplicity. It stripped away all the nuance of complex identities and diplomatic context. It was the ultimate binary test. 10 seconds of silence passed. Ilhan Omar stared at Kennedy. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She looked down at her hands, then over at her lawyers. They were staring blankly at their legal pads, paralyzed. There was no legal objection to a hypothetical question about loyalty. They couldn't save her. 15 seconds. The silence grew louder. It became a roar in the ears of everyone watching. In a political hearing, a pause of this magnitude is catastrophic. It implies calculation where there should be conviction. 20 seconds. Omar's eyes darted around the room. She looked trapped. If she said Somalia, she was admitting to being an enemy of the state. If she said America, she was betraying the homeland she had spent years championing, alienating the foreign interests that funded her, and admitting that her previous rhetoric was a lie. 30 seconds. The longest silence in the history of the committee. Suddenly, a voice cut through the tension like a knife. It came from the audience, row 8. It was Amina Hassan again, standing up, unable to contain herself. "Just say America, Ilhan!" The outburst shocked the room. Omar whipped her head around, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fury. "Why can't you just say America?" Amina shouted, her voice trembling with emotion. "My family chose this country. We took the oath and we meant it. It's not hard. America is our home. Just say it." Another Somali American man in the back stood up. "We can say it. Why can't you?" "You're making us all look bad," a woman in a hijab yelled from the back row. Say it! The hearing room was dissolving into chaos. The chairman banged his gavel, but the sound was weak against the rising tide of the audience's demand. Ilhan Omar had had enough. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping violently against the floor, the sound screeching like a wounded animal. She grabbed her papers with shaking hands, her face flushed with a dark, burning rage. "I am not going to sit here and participate in this racist circus," she shouted, her voice shrill, cracking under the pressure. "This is designed to make Muslims prove their loyalty. I refuse to dignify this." "Ma'am!" Kennedy's voice cut through the noise, calm but commanding. "You are still under oath. You cannot just leave." "Watch me," she hissed. She was moving now, shoving her papers into her briefcase, turning her back on the committee. Her lawyers were scrambling to gather their materials, looking terrified as they hurried to follow her. "Congresswoman!" Kennedy called out to her retreating back. He didn't stand up. He didn't shout. He spoke into the microphone with a deadly, final clarity. "If you walk out of this hearing without answering that question, everyone watching, and millions are watching right now, will know exactly what your silence means." She stopped. She was at the heavy wooden doors. She froze for a heartbeat. "Your refusal to answer is the answer," Kennedy said. Omar turned back one last time. Her hand was on the door handle. She looked at Kennedy, her eyes filled with tears of anger. "My answer is that I don't owe you or anyone else proof of my loyalty to this country. I took the oath. That should be enough. The oath requires you to renounce allegiance to Somalia." Kennedy shot back, his voice finally rising to meet hers. "But you haven't. You call it home. You vote for it. You take its money. The oath isn't enough if you don't honor it." Omar didn't respond. She pushed the door open and vanished into the hallway, followed by a swarm of reporters and cameras. The hearing room erupted. Senators were arguing, photographers were flashing pictures of the empty chair, and the audience was buzzing with the shock of what they had just witnessed. But amidst the pandemonium, John Kennedy sat calmly at his desk. He reached out, straightened his stack of papers, and capped his pen. He looked like a man who had just finished a routine committee meeting, not a man who had just dismantled a political career on live television. He looked at the empty chair where Ilhan Omar had sat, and he knew, as everyone in America knew, that it was over. The wooden doors of the hearing room had barely swung shut behind Ilhan Omar before the digital world caught fire. In the old days of Washington, a scandal took the morning papers to ignite and the evening news to spread. But this was the age of the algorithm, and the destruction of Ilhan Omar's political career happened at the speed of light. Within 3 minutes of her walkout, the clip, not the full 2 hours of forensic dismantling, but the final brutal 30 seconds, was live. It was raw, unedited, and devastating. It showed John Kennedy, calm and immovable, asking the simple question, "Which side would you want to win?" It showed the agonizing, deafening silence. It showed Amina Hassan pleading from the audience. And it showed a sitting member of Congress fleeing the room rather than answering America. By the time Omar's motorcade had made it back to her office in the Longworth building, the hashtag "Which side" was the #1 trending topic in the United States. Within 2 hours, it was trending globally. The video had been viewed 5 million times on X, formerly Twitter, 3 million times on TikTok, and was looping endlessly on every cable news network in the country. But what made this avalanche truly catastrophic for Omar was the direction of the snow. Usually, when she was attacked, the battle lines were drawn predictably. Conservatives attacked, liberals defended. The wagons would circle, the fundraising emails would go out, and the partisan divide would protect her. This time, the wagons didn't circle. They burned. That evening, the shift in the media landscape was palpable. CNN, a network that had frequently given Omar a platform to air her grievances, hosted a panel that felt like a wake. The host, visibly uncomfortable, played the clip and then turned to the panel. "Look," he said, struggling to find a charitable interpretation. "I understand not wanting to engage with what she perceives as a bad faith hypothetical. But it's a loyalty question. It's a binary choice. Every American citizen should be able to say they'd choose America over a foreign adversary. The fact that she couldn't, it's a problem." Over on MSNBC, a network known for its progressive commentary, the legal analyst was even more blunt. "In a court of law, flight is often considered evidence of guilt," she said. "In the court of public opinion, walking out of a hearing because you can't say you want America to win a war? That is a plea of nolo contendere. Her silence on that question is going to haunt her forever, because silence is an answer." The next morning, the New York Times editorial board, the holy grail of liberal validation, published a piece titled "Representative Omar's Troubling Non-Answer." The text was measured, but the subtext was lethal. They argued that while Kennedy's questioning was aggressive, a public servant's allegiance must be unambiguous. But the most devastating blow didn't come from the pundits in Manhattan or the strategists in D.C. It came from Minneapolis. Friday morning, the Twin Cities Somali Coalition, the largest and most influential Somali-American organization in Minnesota, called a press conference. For years, this organization had been Omar's fortress. They were her ground game, her shield, her most loyal voters. The coalition's president stood at a podium surrounded by American flags, a visual choice that screamed its own message. He read from a prepared statement, his voice somber. "We came to America by choice," he began. "We fled Somalia because it failed us, because the government there could not protect us, because we wanted a better life. When we became Americans, we meant it. We chose America." He looked up at the cameras. "We expect our elected representatives to do the same." Congresswoman Omar's refusal to clearly state her allegiance to America is troubling. It does not reflect our community's values. We are Americans first. By Friday afternoon, the floodgates had opened. 15 prominent Somali-American imams in Minnesota signed an open letter that was circulated in mosques across the district. The letter was respectful but firm, a theological and civic rebuke of their most famous congregant. "We love this country," the letter read. "We are grateful for the opportunities America has given us and our children. We are proud Americans who happen to be of Somali heritage. We wish Congresswoman Omar would clearly and proudly state the same." The political architecture around her began to crumble. On Saturday, the Department of Justice announced it was opening a formal investigation into potential violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA, citing the testimony and documents presented at the Senate hearing. This wasn't just a political problem anymore. It was a legal nightmare. On Sunday, the House Ethics Committee announced its own investigation into the financial relationship between Omar's campaign, her husband's firm, and the Somali government-connected entities. Desperate for cover, Omar turned to her closest allies in Congress, the Squad. For years, this group of progressives, AOC, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley, had operated as a phalanx. An attack on one was an attack on all. They moved as a unit, but on Wednesday, the unit fractured. The joint statement released by Representatives Ocasio-Cortez, Tlaib, and Presley was a masterclass in political distance. It was short, cold, and carefully lawyered. "We support Representative Omar's right to push back against Islamophobic lines of questioning," it read. But then came the pivot, the sentence that signaled the end of their unconditional support. "We also believe that all Americans, regardless of heritage, can clearly state their loyalty to this country." Translation: We are not going down with this ship. Ilhan Omar's office went into crisis mode. Over the next week, they released a blizzard of press releases, tweets, and statements. They accused Kennedy of racism. They accused ProPublica of bias. They accused the Somali coalition of being political pawns. They tried to explain the nuance of dual identity. They tried to contextualize the concept of homeland. But in all the thousands of words they churned out, in all the interviews she gave to friendly podcasts, Ilhan Omar never actually answered the question. She never said the words, "I would want America to win." She couldn't. To say it would be to alienate the foreign interests that had bankrolled her rise. To not say it was to alienate the country she served. She was trapped in the silence she had created, and the silence was deafening. The polls were the first indicator that the silence had become a tomb. On the Monday following the hearing, a nonpartisan poll of Minnesota's 5th Congressional District dropped like a bomb. The numbers were shocking for a district that was D+130, one of the safest Democratic seats in the nation. 68% of voters believed Omar should have answered Kennedy's question. 71% believed her refusal to answer indicated divided loyalty. But the most damning number was personal. 54% of her own constituents believed she should resign from Congress. In politics, blood in the water attracts sharks. On Tuesday, Don Samuels, a moderate Democrat and veteran civil rights activist who had nearly beaten Omar in the 2022 primary, stepped up to the microphone. He didn't need a complex platform. He didn't need a 10-point plan. He just needed to be the person who could answer the question. His announcement speech was brief, delivered in a community center packed with the very Somali-American voters Omar had taken for granted. "I love this country without qualification," Samuels said, his voice ringing with the clarity that Omar lacked. "I love it with my whole heart. I can say without hesitation that if forced to choose between America and any other nation on earth, I choose America every time, without question." Apparently, our current representative cannot say the same. That is disqualifying. The campaign that followed was brutal, not because it was dirty, but because it was simple. Samuels played the clip of the silence in every ad. He put it on billboards. He played the audio on the radio. He didn't have to attack her policies. He just had to play her silence. 6 months later, on a humid Tuesday in August, the primary election results began to roll in. Usually, incumbent members of Congress do not lose. When they do, it is by a razor-thin margin, a fraction of a percentage point. But as the precincts reported, the numbers for Ilhan Omar didn't just look bad, they looked like a landslide. She lost the wealthy liberal suburbs that had once championed her as a symbol of diversity. She lost the working-class neighborhoods that cared about bread-and-butter issues, not foreign entanglements. Most painfully, she lost the Somali-heavy precincts in Cedar Riverside. The community she claimed to represent had rejected her at the ballot box. When the Associated Press called the race at 9:15 p.m., the margin was staggering. Ilhan Omar had lost by 18 points. It was the largest margin of defeat for an incumbent member of Congress in Minnesota history. Her concession speech that night was a study in denial. Standing before a thinned-out crowd of die-hard supporters, she talked about fighting the forces of hate. She talked about the corporate money arrayed against her. She talked about her legacy of speaking truth to power. She never mentioned John Kennedy. She never mentioned the hearing. She never mentioned the question. She left the stage to tepid applause, a politician who still didn't understand why the floor had fallen out from under her. A week after the election, a reporter from the Baton Rouge Advocate caught up with Senator John Kennedy. He was back home in Louisiana, wearing a casual polo shirt, sitting on his porch with a glass of iced tea, far removed from the marble halls of the Senate. "Senator," the reporter asked, "now that it's all over, do you think you were fair to her? Some people still say it was a gotcha question." Kennedy took a slow sip of his tea, looking out over the live oaks draped in Spanish moss. He was quiet for a long moment, the brilliant legal mind behind the folksy exterior, turning over the events of the last 6 months. "I didn't trick her, son," Kennedy said softly. "I asked her which country she'd choose. That's not a trick. That's the rent you pay for living in this house." He set his glass down on the table. Every American should be able to answer that instantly. Every naturalized citizen took an oath specifically renouncing allegiance to other countries just so they could answer that question clearly. Her silence wasn't my doing. I just held up the mirror. If she didn't like what she saw, that's on her. "But was it a trap?" the reporter pressed. Kennedy smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "It's only a trap if you're trying to hide something. If you're genuinely loyal to America, you say America without thinking. It's a reflex, like pulling your hand away from a hot stove. The fact that she had to think about it, the fact that she couldn't bring herself to say it, the fact that she ran out of the room rather than say it, that tells you everything you need to know." He leaned back in his chair, the interview effectively over. "She didn't lose her seat because of me. She lost her seat because she forgot that you can't serve two masters. Not in the Bible, and certainly not in the United States Congress. The lesson of the fall of Ilhan Omar was written not in the laws passed or the speeches given, but in the silence she left behind. It was a stark reminder that in the American experiment, heritage is celebrated, culture is cherished, and diversity is honored. But allegiance must be singular. You can love the place you came from, you can honor your roots, but if you want to hold the public trust, if you want to wield the power of the American people, you must belong to them, and to them alone. Ilhan Omar couldn't make that promise. And in the end, the country she wouldn't choose chose to move on without her.